freeing so we can find a way to create a story about our origins and who we are. This is where we've been so far. We started it Labor Day weekend. Following my sabbatical, we spent August talking Sabbath and rest and the importance of rhythm. Labor Day is when we recognize our culture knows something about that and says, yes, we should take a day off work because it's so important to not take it for granted. Our workers, our rights, having a job. How important it is as church people have a vocation. What is God calling you to? Yes, your rest is a key part of that, taking care of self, so that then you can go and work, even in retirement, leave a legacy, make a difference in your family, in your world. We're called. The Exodus story starts with a huge no to Pharaoh. These radical women standing up in civil disobedience. And so are we reminded that often our own faith requires a standing, an unpopular stance, a political claim that, wait a minute, I do know something about God and about justice. And here's what God wanted for the Hebrew children. And for us, here's what God needs for my life. Often the path out of stuckness, captivity, is a very angry step initially. Rohr, of course, is our book for the year. Richard Rohr, Falling Upward. He enjoys this a lot. He says, because what happens in our first half of life, we kind of get sold a bill of goods. We kind of get habituated into working, running the cycle, doing the thing. Spirituality is about saying, hang on, is this exactly what I signed on for? Hang on, I know everyone expects me to do this. Is this what I need to do? Or is God requiring something else? And so the first step of that spirituality for second half of life is often similarly as abrupt as this break. The women who are around Moses first draw him out of the water. And I compared that to our resurrection accounts where Jesus, as the new and improved Moses, also draws us up out of the tomb. The ancient tradition that we've kind of lost sight of is Jesus as a leader of an uprising. It's resurrection. We're raised to Jesus, and the most ancient artwork has got hands with people dragging him up out of that tomb. We interpreted early on we needed freeing, liberating. Jesus raises us so we can have a chain of people. I was at a birthday party last night where they did the Ramba, the dance, everyone lined up, and I thought, this is it. That's the image for resurrection, is you join the party and you go out and you wind your way through the tables. And that's where we are. We've declared, that's what we're supposed to be about. Not just, am I saved, but look who saves me. Who am I helping in this resurrection event? Moses gets drawn up. We focused on burning bush situations after that, and this has been our central mode for a number of weeks, because for a lot of us, our most private experiences, our most divine experiences, we're a little afraid to talk about. We've known God, we've known despair and salvation, we've been at that bush, and we're a little afraid to talk about it. It's holy ground, we're supposed to take off our shoes, we treat it with reverence. One of the great tensions with institutional religion is, how do we take the individuality, that profoundly private, mystical piece of the Spirit, and bring it forward, recognize it, celebrate it without just whitewashing it into some that everyone should be the same, or now we just do this. We have huge, important secrets that we ought to be telling. And then we recognize our resistance in the ministry of crummy excuses. We are the people who forever have been like Moses before that bush, saying, hang on, God, I hear what you're saying, but really, and a long list he pulls up of excuses. We're the same way. I don't think discernment is our biggest problem. I think courage is our biggest problem. We often do know what we'd like to say to our kids. We often do know what we should be leading into work. We're afraid. You're in good company. You're in great company. As a matter of fact, I think Richard Rohr, as much as he is wise, he's tried to instill in us, in the second half of life, a sense of courage and looking a little deeper. It's not what we've been taught. It is threatening. It requires something more of us today, especially as we wade. Then we talked about the plagues, a wonderful collection of horrible stories. And in this case, it was all designed to supposedly change Pharaoh's mind. But of course, as we find today, Pharaoh's mind is in God's hands in some way. And we're the same way. No matter how much proof we have, evidence we have, often we decide, change our mind. Pharaoh says, doesn't matter what these horrible things have happened. I want these slaves. And then last week, the central theological event, really, today is the most dramatic event. The central theological, the taking of the firstborn and Passover. There's a central Jewish theological holiday to say, God chose us, God redeems us. And we really tell much of the same story about our firstborn at the cross. God's decision to come and take. And then I did some more theological conversation as a group. And if you haven't seen it, I record it on video, just that handout on atonement, because it's difficult stuff. How do we move out of this bloodthirsty blood atonement that is a part of our tradition, but I don't think a healthy or important part. Yet it's 90% of what our culture sees as Christianity is about. How do we move beyond that as disciples? How do we understand both Passover and crucifixion in ways that don't encourage great violence? Here's this, first of all, Grant. You're going to like this, in case you've forgotten.
Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in the wilderness?
Why must we die?
Fear not! Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. The pillar of fire! It is the breath of God! Great one, you cannot reach the fire of God. Gather your families and your flocks. We must go with all speed. Go where? To drown in the sea? How long will the fire hold Pharaoh back?
Will it hold?
After this day, you shall see his chariots no more. No! You'll be dead under them. No. The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand. God opens the sea with the blast of his nostrils. Lead them through the midst of the waters. His will be done.
He opens the waters before them, and he bars our way with fire. Let us go from this place. Men cannot fight against a God.
Better to die in battle with a God than live in shame.
Praise God and down into it!
To serve the Egyptians than to die here. Who shall withstand the power of God? Thou didst blow with thy winds, and the sea covered them. Who is like unto thee, O Lord? From everlasting to everlasting, thou art God.
Right.
No animals were harmed.
In the filming of this, exactly. And I don't know why Moses speaks so, thou art, and starts quoting scripture. It's our sense that, and this is 1956, so we might laugh at the special effects. They were awesome for the time. And by the time I saw this as a kid, this was already an old movie. We believed, of course, then that some of us, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and so he seems to be kind of reciting them even as he's putting his staff. And what a great scene. God hardens Pharaoh's heart, as we heard, as we were mentioning a couple weeks back. This is to make sure we know the most dramatic central event is not in the hands of some whimsical people. God knows what she's doing. The numbers we have in this passage have to do with 600 chariots and horses, and that earlier it said 600,000 Hebrews. There are no historians who think that's anything other than a symbolic number. The entire population of Egypt was only somewhat more than that. And we have no evidence of that kind of multitude traveling anywhere. So we don't know what it means. Your guess is almost as good as mine. There's lots of symbology in the Bible, but people throw back and forth about these sixes, then 600, 600,000. We don't know. I do know this, Ron Byerly. I'm so glad you're here today. Ron has to come to worship in case his name shows up on screen. Ron's been reading a book, a great book you've been telling me about, suggesting that the Old Testament histories we read in Genesis, Exodus, aren't so much about these events, in this case 1300 BCE, but in fact they're about events happening in 6 and 7 and 800, 500 years later, if your math is following all that. That we don't get around to telling the stories, let alone writing the stories, let alone sanctioning them and passing them around until generations go by. So I thought of you this week because some of the commentaries say the escape from Egypt is portrayed as happening in the 13th century, the 1200s, before the Common Era, all right? Maybe as early as 1300. What's interesting is while we use donkeys and horses for plowing, there's no evidence of their being domesticated for riding, for pulling chariots until they said 800. And I said, you better talk to Ron Byerly. He's going to say 600. So this rather out-of-time notion of what we were using horses for in soldiering and chasing down and archery may in fact be stories of political difficulty as we were settling in the land in later centuries, retrojected back to this memory of how we got out of Egypt hundreds of years earlier. This guy's my favorite in the white because it's one of the best lines in the whole Bible. Did you drag us out here to die because there's no graves back in Egypt? I mean, if this isn't the snarkiest, most cynical line in that book in your hand, it's right up there. And he's here played well, this hesitation. More on a minute on him. We read in Exodus about during the day, it's a pillar of cloud, and then at night it turns into this pillar of fire to lead and protect, guide us through. And we saw it here in the movie clip from the Ten Commandments. And then this, and they walked on dry land. I was going to bring my old Bible that I got as a 4th grader, my RSV, that has, 4 pictures in the whole thing? That's it. But that's one of them. And I used to just pore over that picture because you could see the chariot wheels and the horses, and I thought how awful and sad. And you could see Moses with this, and I was always torn. It hasn't changed. Always torn by the story, the tragedy of it, and attracted to the story because it's so exciting. It's the most spectacular episode in all of Scripture, right? The most, we wish we'd been there to see it, film it. So I had to bring it in today. But I always wondered, even in 4th grade, as Mrs. Nalos was teaching us, dry land? I don't know, I've had problems for a long time. And I thought, that wind may have separated out, but I was raised in Seattle, where it doesn't matter. It's July, and you're playing with Chuck Wells in your back row with your Tonka trucks. You dig a couple inches down, why is it wet here? It's always wet. And in the driest of times, Marty, are you laughing at my skepticism? Marty's doing a Moses thing.
What? He parts the sea and you're concerned about whether he could dry the land?
Amen. I see whose side you're taking. I know. This is my difficulty. I get it. We're moving on. Turn to Exodus 15. I want you to know. That's right. Edit that out. Exodus 15, 1 through 10. I want us to read this together because it's a great celebration of this most dramatic event in our history. Chapter 15 in your pew Bible. Looks like I'm on page 61. It's called the Song of Moses. More on that in a minute. I'd like us to read this out loud. And I even think, I saw today, it's kind of separated somewhat into thirds. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We're adapting to the different sanctuary layout. Reading it out loud, I'll point to you whatever verse 1. Starting with verse 1 here, the Song of Moses. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. For his rider he has thrown into the sea. 2. The Lord is my strength and my might. He has become my salvation. This is my God. I will praise him. My Father's God. I will exalt him. 3 over here. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. 4. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. He picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. 5. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. 6. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord. 7. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew their adversaries. You sent out your fury. It consumed them like 8. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. 9. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. Everyone on 10. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mud. I keep that open for a minute because we need to look at the end of 15 here in a minute. Here's how it has always happened with us. There's an event, there's a retelling of that event, and that retelling becomes contagious, and people say, I like that story. I like this notion that you guys were freed from Pharaoh. I might join your band. Or we would say, there's an event called history and Christianity, and in worship we try to tell the story, hoping that people will gather around saying, that hasn't always been my story, but I would like to align myself with these people who are telling stories of what God has done for them. All right? And then, as we gain identity, we want to retell in our own lives how that applies. How I see it happening. We'll be here in a few weeks when we get out of Egypt. And then only later when we get established and our feet get dried off, does someone start writing it down what happened. A more formal illustration of what that is, and even sometimes what it means, where we saw God, etc. And then there's always someone to say, but how did we get in Egypt in the first place? How did we get into that mess that God got us out of? Oh, well, actually, so-and-so had a grandpa who had been down in Egypt before, and later on we're telling the story of not just Moses of the Exodus, not just his upbringing, how did he get there, but his forefathers, our forefathers, and we're back into all of Genesis. That's how history happens. That's how we got here today. We keep on reciting and remembering. Look at the end of Exodus. I've pointed this out before. Don't want to make too much of it other than this. The central retelling of our story was, again, women, not men. We're here so many times in Exodus especially. Look at verses 20 and 21. It set out the song of Miriam. Is this the first time in history that men have taken women's tradition and owned it for themselves? Talk to any historian of texts and they'll say what happens is you end up with a core text that gets added onto, embellished, recopied, etc. Because in holy texts especially you tend not to subtract, you add on. And in this case, think of resurrection for that matter. Here's the story the women tell. That's not going to be any good. We better have some men tell this story. What we know after battle, the men were getting drunk, recovering, relaxing. It was the women's job in our first tribes to tell stories and to sing the songs. Men didn't do the dancing and retelling. So when I turned you to 15, 20, and 21 for us to read together, I don't think there's anything earlier than this. I don't know, this is hard to get my head around. I woke up. The first time I knew anything, we were still panting and our feet were wet, and Miriam was singing. And we said, God must be good. And then we did this cycle. What happened? And then Moses' sidekick said, we can fill that out with better, proper language and more verses, longer, and Moses' song. Well, yeah, that's not how it happened. The women got together just this side when we had just been saved for the first time, before going through the rest of Exodus and telling the story and backing it up with how we got to the Red Sea. Here's what happened. Here's the first event in our Judeo-Christian tradition. It's campfire. We're scared. I don't know how many of us there are, because later on we're going to grow in number, because people say, wow, did you hear what happened out in the desert yesterday? Those are my kind of people. Here's what she sang. Let's sing the first verses of our identity. 15, 20, and 21. It's called the Song of Miriam. Let's read these two verses together. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out with her, with tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. That's the first Jewish song. It's the first Jewish recitation. Everything else is accretions following that, adding on, explaining it, building up to it. And of course, everything we're about as Christianity follows that. 15, 20, and 21. We don't have time today to get into bread and water. We'll have to do that later. This is the great miracle of the manna in the wilderness. Wonderful how God provides for us on the other side. What I want to focus to in closing today is just this. There's no way to freedom without getting our feet wet. If we're going to be mature disciples, we want to do the hard work of saying, wait a minute, what was our part in joining with liberation? And if you're really good, Richard Rohr wants you to go here. What was our part in remaining in captivity? I bring that up because following Miriam's song, the next day they had a therapy session. And our therapist was sitting here and asked Miriam and Moses, and why did you stay in Egypt so long? Tell me again what the initiating event was that said you'd finally had enough. Miriam, Moses' sister, remember? So it was family counseling. And, well, I've always been one to put up with too much. I've always put up with abuse. I don't think highly enough of myself. I don't have enough ego strength. I've let people walk over me since time immemorial. And finally, Moses had had enough. Or actually, his sister talked him into it. Who knows what it really was about. When we talk liberation, we have to ask, although we never want to ask, what was my part in playing victim? What was my part in putting up with it for so damn long? Actually, it says 400 years we're in captivity. How many generations before? Wow. In your life too. In the worst part of your life that you want to blame on someone else, what is your part in pretending to be powerless? What is your part in sanctioning injustice? Because it's easier that way. I'll just keep on making bricks. Because God knows what I would do out in the wilderness. I know those are mean questions. I get it. The water is significant in our tradition. We start in water at creation. The next story about water is this dividing of the waters, just like at creation. God put a firmament in. It's a repeat of that at the Red Sea. God is able to make a firmament somehow to separate out, and we reenact this in another generation or 5 when we get into the Promised Land by crossing the Jordan River. And there's a great story about the waters piling up on one side and the people walking through. We kept on recognizing that the chaos, the flood of waters is how we're redeemed, saved, created. And so the central piece is also about waters. I want to finish with some readings from Richard Rohr, because next week we're starting into this chapter. Chapter 3, it's really the heart of his main explanation in this book. It's called The First Half of Life. He wants us to start thinking hard about how we got here. How about this? On page 25, if you're following along. Next week after worship, we'll have to jump into this with your questions and concerns. We had an easy week last week, easy chapter. Now we're here. The world is more magical, less predictable, more autonomous, less controllable. That's really important. More varied, less simple, more infinite, less knowable, more wonderfully troubling than we could have imagined being able to tolerate when we were young. Marcus Borg talks about re-enchanting our world with God. That growing spiritually says, wait a minute, I used to think it was all about this and saying the magic words and controlling things, and then I'd keep on pedaling and then I'd achieve. Adults know that's not true. But it takes some hardship to get here. 26. Ironically, you actually need a very strong ego structure to let go of your ego. That is a mysterious statement, but there it is. Spirituality for the second half of life requires some maturity and strength if we're going to grow. It's easier not to grow. Easier to ride along, parrot what we've been taught, pretend to go through the motions. Rohr says, here's the difficulty in moving beyond simple ego answers. It's tough work. It's the hardest work. If you're a skier, you know this from 28. People who have never allowed themselves to fall are actually off balance while not realizing it at all. That's why they are so hard to live with. I was going to say, have you been around these people? I could ask, have you been this person? I have. So set in our ways, so secure of who we are, even though I'm out of balance and I've got an ego that's trying to break apart because I need to grow into something else, I'm going to be there's no one more insistent. This is fundamentalism of 1,000 different sorts, where we believe mistakenly there's too much invested in the ego as it is. So even though we're out of balance, I'm unstoppable. That's our president in spades, as a matter of fact. Profoundly immature, unhealthy, more sure than any person we'll ever meet. Finally, 31. If you want a job done, this is Rohr talking about brokenness, people who are willing to take the chance to grow. If you want a job done well, on time, with accountability and no excuses, you had best hire somebody who has faced a few limit situations. He means the brokenness, coming to the end of themselves, recognizing they can't. He or she alone has the discipline, the punctuality, the positive self-image, and the persistence to do a good job. And then here's one of the meanest sentences in this whole book. If you want the opposite, hire someone who has been coddled, who has been given "I am special" buttons for doing nothing special, has had all his or her bills paid by others, and whose basic egocentricity has never been challenged or undercut. To be honest, this seems to describe much of the workforce and student body of America. Ouch. We know this. We're too nice to say this about our children and grandkids, but there it is. Or about ourselves, who's never had their basic egocentricity called into question, because we hate having it called into question. It hurts like crazy and it's an offensive thing. Rohr says that is just the first step. How do we get there? What I love about this guy saying, in Moses' face, are you insane? Were there no graves in Egypt? Is that why this disaster is about to happen? I'd rather go and die, what did he say, die with an army than drown here or something. Which, by the way, is echoed, paralleled in Pharaoh's line later on. Saying better to face this God and die than to have to retreat in shame or something like that. Well, God, there's ego speaking. What I want to know, unless Marty was there, the first stand up, Moses has his hand in the air and the stick. Later on, Robert, isn't there a battle later on where Moses has to have someone to hold his arm? Yeah. Because you're only good as long as that staff's... So they have like second and third chair people to say, my turn holding his arm up. Beautiful. We're pre that. This is the first time we've seen this miracle happen, and I'm not going to be the first guy in that water, or in the dry land. Because the walls are on either side, and you're thinking, okay, hey, what happens if, okay, you'll keep your arm in the air then? Who's the first one to say, let's go. That's not me. Wading in the water is the old spiritual. Wade in the water. That's how there's no way to stay on the shore and be certain of God's love for you and God's insistence that you should really grow up without jumping in. What's your part in your captivity? What is your investment in staying as stuck as you have been for so long? And what is your part in saying, I've had enough, his arms in the air, someone's got to be first, doggone it, this feels awful. This feels scary and threatening. It doesn't look right. I'm going to drown. It's about participation and daring to be the kind of people who trust God enough to know God needs us to take those first steps too. That is bad news, I get it. It's just the way it's set up. That's just a law of physics. God is powerless to do anything in your life unless you'll say, oh, this seems like a really bad idea. Okay. That's the way it is. Wade in the water. May God continue to challenge us, hold out the good news that is really good news, but is usually a hard or bad news before it's good news. And may we be the kind of disciples courageous enough, faithful enough, trusting enough to help one another take those steps. Amen.